Factories aren't supposed to breathe, but these do. Tonight, we uncover 5 terrifying tales of factories that never sleep. Story 1. The Last Shift. Thomas had been working the night shift at Blackwell Industries for nearly a decade. The factory, an aging structure with rusted beams and dim overhead lights, produced industrial machinery. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills. Lately, though, things had felt different. It started with the noises, metallic scraping sounds in the empty assembly lines, as if something was moving when no one was there. Then came the whispers. At first, Thomas thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Long shifts and exhaustion could do that, but soon he realized they weren't in his head. Leave now. The voice was faint, almost blending with the hum of the machines. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself it was the wind slipping through the ventilation ducts. But the more he ignored it, the stronger it became. One night, during a particularly slow shift, Thomas noticed something strange. The security cameras, old but functional, flickered for a moment. On the grainy screen, a shadow moved along the conveyor belt. But when he turned his head, nothing was there. He laughed nervously. Just the damn cameras acting up again. But then the machines turned on. The conveyor belts whirred to life. Sparks flew from the welding stations. The robotic arms jerked and twitched like they had minds of their own. Thomas backed away, his pulse pounding. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing in the empty factory. No answer. Then he saw it, a figure standing at the end of the assembly line. It was human-shaped but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head slightly tilted, and its body covered in metal plating like it had been stitched together from spare parts. Worst of all were its eyes, empty sockets filled with darkness. Thomas stumbled back as the figure took a step forward, the sound of metal scraping against the floor. Panic set in. He turned and ran, sprinting toward the exit. But the factory had changed. The layout was different. Hallways stretched longer than they should. Doors that should have led outside now opened into pitch-black voids. Behind him, the clanking footsteps grew louder. He dashed into the locker room, slamming the door shut. His breath came in ragged gasps as he fumbled for his phone. No signal, of course. Then the lights flickered, and he heard the lockers begin to rattle. One by one, they burst open. Rusted metal doors banged against the walls. And then, silence. A cold breath tickled the back of his neck. He turned. The figure was there, inches away. Its skeletal metal fingers reached out, and everything went dark. The next morning, the factory opened as usual. Workers arrived, clocked in, and took their places. No one noticed Thomas's locker. No one noticed the faint, bloody handprint smeared across its surface. And no one noticed that, from the security camera feed, a shadow stood in the corner, watching. Story 2. The Midnight Factory. Daniel Carter had been desperate for work. Bills piled up. His landlord was losing patience, and his fridge was nearly empty. When he saw the ad for an overnight shift at Grayson Industrial, he didn't hesitate. The factory sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by overgrown fields and an eerie silence that seemed unnatural. The pay was suspiciously high for unskilled labor, but Daniel was in no position to ask questions. On his first night, the foreman, a gaunt man named Mr. Holloway, led him through the dimly lit factory. The air smelled of rust and oil, and the massive machines hummed with an almost living presence. "You're on the assembly line," Holloway muttered. "Just keep the parts moving. Don't wander." Daniel nodded, gripping his lunchbox tightly. The other workers were quiet, their faces pale and expressionless. Something about the place felt off, but he shrugged it off as nerves. He needed the money. By the second night, Daniel began noticing strange things. The rhythmic clanking of the machines sometimes sounded like distant voices. The shadows in the corners seemed darker than they should be, shifting when he wasn't looking directly at them. Then came the whispers. At first, he thought it was the other workers, but they never spoke. Their dead-eyed stares remained locked on their tasks. The whispers, however, came from the walls, from the vents, from places no voice should come from. "Leave. while you can. Daniel spun around, but no one was there. He shuddered, rubbing his arms. Maybe he was just tired. But then he noticed something even stranger. The workers never left. Even when his shift ended, they remained at their stations, motionless, until the next crew arrived. When he asked Holloway about it, the foreman merely grunted. Not your concern. Daniel didn't press further. One night, during his break, Daniel wandered down a dimly lit corridor and found a door marked restricted. He swore he heard something breathing behind it. A low, guttural sound that sent ice through his veins. He reached for the handle. Don't. He turned sharply. One of the older workers, a frail man with deep bags under his eyes, stood behind him. That door stays locked. Always. Daniel hesitated but nodded. He'd seen enough horror movies to know when to listen. Weeks passed, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The whispers grew louder, and now, something moved in the darkness beyond the machines. One night, while working alone on the far end of the factory floor, he heard it. A scraping sound like metal dragging against concrete. He turned, his heart hammering. A figure stood at the edge of the shadows. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were thin, elongated, almost insect-like. Its face was a featureless void except for two glowing pinpricks of light where eyes should be. Daniel stumbled back. The figure didn't move. Then, slowly, it raised one skeletal finger and pointed directly at him. Daniel ran. Desperate for answers, Daniel decided to stay after his shift. He hid in a storage closet, waiting until the factory was empty. Except, it was never empty. As the lights dimmed, the workers remained, but they weren't working anymore. They stood, rigid and silent, facing the locked door. Then, as if responding to an unseen signal, they moved in unison, unlocking it and stepping inside. Daniel crept forward and peeked inside. What he saw shattered his sanity. A massive machine sat in the center of the room, its gears twisting and churning like some mechanical heart. Tubes ran from it attached to the workers' bodies. They weren't people anymore. They were part of the factory. Holloway stood beside the machine, his face twisted in something between a grin and a grimace. The factory must feed, he whispered. Daniel backed away, but the workers turned as one, their dead eyes locking onto him. Then they moved. Daniel ran, weaving through the dark corridors as the sound of metal feet echoed behind him. The factory was shifting. Doors that should lead outside now led deeper into the labyrinth of machinery. He reached the main doors and yanked them open, expecting freedom. Instead, he found himself back on the factory floor. No, he whispered. The shadows coalesced around him, and the last thing he saw was Holloway, standing over him, whispering the words that would haunt him forever. Welcome to the machine. A week later, a new worker was hired at Grayson Industrial. He never noticed the extra machine at the end of the line, or the way it hummed, like something was alive inside it. Story 3. The Hollow Factory. Nathan Pierce needed a fresh start. When he was offered a job at Holloway Manufacturing, a once booming factory now barely running, he took it without hesitation. The factory sat on the edge of town, its metal walls rusted, its windows dark. The moment he stepped inside, he felt something was off. The air was thick, almost heavy, and the sound of machines droned like a heartbeat. The foreman, Mr. Grayson, was an older man with hollow cheeks and tired eyes. Work hard, don't ask questions, and you'll be fine, he said before leading Nathan to his station. The other workers barely acknowledged his presence. Their movements were slow, mechanical. Something about them felt wrong. On his third night, Nathan began to notice the whispers. At first, he thought it was just the wind slipping through the cracks in the factory walls. But as he listened, he realized the voices were calling his name. Nathan, leave. Before it wakes, his blood turned cold. He turned to the worker beside him, a gaunt woman with sunken eyes. Did you hear that? He asked. She didn't answer. She just kept working, her fingers moving in perfect, synchronized patterns. The voices didn't stop. They grew louder. There was a section of the factory hidden behind heavy iron doors. No one spoke about it. No one looked in its direction. But every night, at exactly 3 a.m., the sound of something massive stirring echoed from within. Curiosity got the better of Nathan. One night he hid and waited. As the hour struck, the doors creaked open, and a shadow spilled out. A machine unlike anything he had ever seen crawled forward. Its gears twisted unnaturally, and black sludge dripped from its joints. The workers didn't react. They only knelt. And then the machine turned towards Nathan. Nathan ran, but the factory corridors twisted, leading him back to the machine. Mr. Grayson stood beside it, his face unreadable. "You weren't supposed to see this," he said softly. "But it's too late now." Nathan's breath hitched as he saw the truth. The machine was alive. The steel frame pulsated like breathing lungs. The workers weren't just obeying it, they were feeding it. Grayson grabbed Nathan's arm. "You'll understand soon enough." Pain exploded in Nathan's skull. Darkness swallowed him whole. Nathan awoke at his station. His hands moved automatically, placing parts on the assembly line. He couldn't remember why he had been afraid. The machine behind the iron doors hummed, satisfied. And Nathan never thought about leaving again. Story 4. The Endless Shift. Jake Holloway had been out of work for months when he got the call. A factory called Dunwich Industries was hiring, and the pay was nearly double what he'd made before. The job description was vague, but desperation clouded his judgment. He packed his things and drove deep into the countryside, where the factory loomed against a blood-red sunset. An older man in a faded blue uniform met him at the gate. "You show up on time, you do the work, and you don't ask questions," he said. "Simple enough?" Jake nodded. He just needed a paycheck. But as he stepped inside, a chill ran through him. The air smelled of oil and decay, and the machines groaned like wounded animals. Jake's first shift was uneventful at first. The factory floor stretched on endlessly, filled with rows of hulking machines whose purpose was unclear. His only task was to press a single button at set intervals. No explanation, no details. Just press and wait. The other workers barely acknowledged him. Their faces were hollow, their eyes empty. They moved in perfect synchronization, never speaking, never hesitating. Then, around midnight, Jake heard it. A whisper. Something moved between the machines just out of sight. When he turned, there was nothing there. But the whispers remained, slithering into his ears like living things. "Run." On his third night, Jake noticed something strange. There was a hallway the workers avoided, leading to a heavy iron door marked restricted. It was locked with an elaborate mechanism, its surface covered in deep scratches. During his break, he lingered near it, pressing his ear to the cold metal. He heard breathing. Something was inside. "You shouldn't be here." Jake spun around. One of the workers, a woman with sunken eyes, was staring at him. "Go back. Forget this door." He wanted to ask why, but her expression made it clear. Some questions weren't meant to be answered. That night, the factory changed. The machines no longer sounded like machinery. They screamed. Jake's button-pressing station flickered with failing light, and the air turned thick. The whispers were louder now, forming words in his mind. "It feeds. It waits. It knows." When Jake glanced at his co-workers, his stomach twisted. Their faces were melting, skin bubbling like wax, their limbs jerking unnaturally. And yet, they kept working as if nothing was wrong. Then the factory doors slammed shut, locking Jake inside. He ran. The machines groaned and shifted as if they were alive. Shadows stretched and twisted, clawing at him with inky fingers. He reached the restricted door and, without thinking, pulled the lever beside it. The door opened. Inside, a thing sat at the center of an elaborate control room, a grotesque fusion of metal and flesh. Wires burrowed into its exposed organs. It turned its hollow eyes toward Jake and grinned. "New worker," it rasped. Jake screamed as the darkness swallowed him. Days later, a new hire arrived at Dunwich Industries. He was given the same instructions. Show up, work hard, don't ask questions. He never noticed the extra machine in the corner, or the way it hummed, like something alive inside it. Story 5. The Rusted Veins. Ethan McCall never wanted to return to Blackridge Industrial, but when the factory reopened under new management, the paycheck was too good to ignore. The place had been abandoned for decades after a mysterious fire wiped out most of its workforce. Now, it stood resurrected, its smokestacks belching out thick plumes under an iron sky. As he walked through the gates, a wave of unease washed over him. The building loomed like a corpse refusing to rot. The inside was worse, walls lined with rusted pipes, machines humming with unnatural energy. The air smelled of burnt metal and something foul, something rotting. The foreman, a man named Mr. Decker, greeted him with a cold stare. "Welcome back," he muttered, though Ethan had never worked there before. Ethan's job was simple: monitor the assembly line. The problem was that nothing was being assembled, at least nothing he recognized. The machines ran without supervision, grinding, shaping, twisting materials he couldn't identify. The other workers didn't talk, their faces pale and waxy under the harsh lights. Then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the factory shuttered. The lights flickered, and Ethan saw something impossible. A figure standing inside one of the machines, its body stretched unnaturally through the gears. When he blinked, it was gone. A whisper brushed his ear. "Help us." Ethan's curiosity got the best of him. On his break, he followed the pipes down a service tunnel and found a rusted door marked "Do Not Open." Behind it, stairs spiraled downward into blackness. He descended, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was vast, filled with rows of metal coffins. But these weren't storage units. They were incubation chambers. Something inside them moved. When Ethan returned upstairs, he found the factory changed. The machines moved as if alive, pulsating like organs. The workers no longer looked human, their eyes sunken, their skin turning metallic. Mr. Decker stood near the main control panel. "You should have stayed in your place," he growled, his voice layered with something inhuman. Behind him, the assembly line birthed something new. Not a product, not machinery, a body. It turned its head toward Ethan, and he saw his own face stitched together from metal and flesh. Ethan ran, but the factory had sealed itself shut. The machines howled, their gears grinding like bones snapping. He felt his skin tighten, his veins burning as something inside him changed. The whisper returned, "You belong to the factory now." His vision blurred. The last thing he saw was Mr. Decker watching as his fingers turned to steel, his thoughts dissolving into the rhythm of the endless machine. The next shift began. A new worker arrived, and the factory kept running. If you made it this far, congratulations. You survived the shift. But tell me, would you ever step foot into a factory again? If you enjoyed these terrifying tales, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, because we have many more chilling stories waiting to be told.